I wrote this as a kind of rationale for this module. I suppose what I was thinking about was that the module is really concerned with the act of looking and seeing and interpreting. And you could understand these as quite distinct processes, really. So perhaps looking is a much more physical activity, a kind of gestural and physical act. Whereas I think seeing is a much more mental and psychological activity. So you often say things like, ah, yeah, I see it now. So there's a sense perhaps in which you've processed what that looking was. And then the next step, I suppose, on from that is the process of reflection or interpretation. In the film Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, Grace Kelly's character becomes aware that a neighbour may have committed a crime. And she says to Jimmy Stewart, her husband, who's an ex-war photographer, she says, "Tell me everything you think you saw and what you think it means." And I really like this line because there's a sense of doubt about what's actually being perceived. There's a sense that there is actually room for error in this, and therefore, I suppose, debate and discussion about what's being seen. And I think this is perhaps one of the great things about studying art and design. It is, in essence, a kind of training for the eye and the mind and the hands. And I suppose everybody has their own perspective on what it is that you actually have seen. There can't really be any wrong, I don't think, here. In fact, I suppose often the more wrong and the more unique and the more individual the perception, the closer you are to the idea of the traditional function of the artist. It's often thought that the job of art and design generally is to show others how to see the world differently. And this goes back to the early 20th century with someone like Viktor Shklovsky, who was a Russian literary critic, who wrote that the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are actually known. The technique of art is to make things and objects unfamiliar. Art makes the familiar strange so that it can be freshly perceived. Or as the novelist Anne Nin said, it's the function of art to renew our perception. What we are familiar with, we cease to see. And yet, I suppose at the same time, seeing is also really primarily a kind of cultural phenomenon. We see the world as we're taught by our culture to see it. So, for instance, in Australia, Aboriginal children come to see the world from above, from a kind of God's eye point of view, whereas though we in the West have learned culturally to understand perspective as a kind of artificial device that mimics how we perceive the three-dimensional world on two-dimensional surfaces. So I suppose we see as other people see. And I suppose as visual communicators, we can only really communicate what we see when the viewer or audience actually share that same way of seeing or the same codes and conventions of perceiving the world. As graphic communicators and designers, we're constantly walking this tightrope between seeing the world as our audience might see it and perhaps being able to communicate in a more unique or idiosyncratic or more personal kind of way. So often it's to take that viewer's perception of the world and then maybe take it further or to challenge it rather than simply revert to cliches or rather hackneyed communications. Often we become visual communicators and designers because we consciously like to look at things, both in terms of the way that they look, but also what they might mean. And I suppose the kind of question is, are these two connected? So looking at the world, seeing small differences and patterns, becoming kind of fixated on colour and shape. At times these things can feel a bit like frivolous, especially in a world that's teetering on the edge of environmental and political collapse. It can kind of feel quite shamefully trivial perhaps. But I think this is wrong. Looking at and truly seeing and interpreting, I think, is a real lifelong skill. And I think it's one that's endlessly rewarding and which I think is increasingly important in a world that's mediated through imagery. As graphic communicators, we both produce this environment and we are also produced by this environment. So we need to really learn to look and to see by giving ourselves permission to explore our environment, both physical, visual and auditory in some real depth. And in this module, I would hope you'll explore how to make sense of a range of visual imagery, primarily using things like semiotics, the study of signs. I think it's important to understand the wider historical context that this seeing takes place. It does not exist outside of time and place. So, for instance, if you're looking at a Cubist painting from the early 20th century or an advertisement for soft drinks from the 1960s, if you're looking at it now, it's not the same as it was for when those images were produced. And so I think we need to start to locate ourselves within a wider tradition or a history. And so, as a result of this, in this module, this is why we're doing this series of 7 talks. This is called A History in 50 Images, and I would hope that it attempts to give you a bit of an understanding of this wider historical context in terms of ways of seeing. This is image number 1. It's a poster by a designer called Malcolm Frost for the Harrogate International Festival in 1977. I chose this image because for me it's inextricably linked with the first time that I heard the term graphic design. Malcolm lived with my family for a few years when I was 8 or 9 years old at the top of a big drafty Victorian house at the time that he made this poster. What Malcolm did was a bit of a mystery to me. He would trudge downstairs in the morning for a coffee, collect his post, then trudge back pigeon-toed to his attic. Occasionally Malcolm would allow me and my brother to actually see what he did in his room, with its large drawing board. He would let us play with his Letraset, the dry transfer rub-down letters he used to mock his designs up with. To an 8-year-old this looked like a lot of fun. He showed us how he'd cut and paste with scalpels and cow gum, allowed us to draw with his rotring pens, and the whole room was full of exotic tools and instruments. On the drawing board was this poster, mocked up, obviously rough, with kind of marks and bits of glue and Letraset. And this image stuck in my mind. It was obviously graphic, with the simple graphic silhouettes of these horses, and I was intrigued by the relationship between the words and the image. It was enigmatic, like a game I didn't quite understand. I was used to words and images in my comic books and on TV, but this seemed different. Then I saw this poster pasted onto the walls around town, and I was struck by its size and its simplicity and its impact. What seemed rough and worked on when I saw it on the drawing board now was suddenly transformed into something perfect and seamless. Then it had gone from my life. Malcolm moved on to other projects that I could hear him swearing very loudly about in his Cockney twang. And from all this, I suppose, I learnt a number of things. Malcolm was a designer who designed a number of different things. Posters, magazines and logos like the one that you can see at the top right of this poster. He was designing these things to be sent away to be reproduced, and he was always on the phone to what I assume were printers and clients. He was only really roughly making the thing himself. He was planning it or strategizing it, roughing it up, mocking it up. My dad, however, painted in another room in the house, and he made things that were one-offs. They were unrepeatable, and they took a long time in his spare time as a hobby. Malcolm had a job. He was not creating these things from scratch, but he was borrowing other people's words and images, rearranging them, recombining them, reformatting them like I did with the images from my comic books. I also learned that he could do this job in a studio, surrounded by all these various tools and instruments, that it was a kind of craft. And it took place not in stuffy offices or in artists' garrets, but in a design studio. I learned that Malcolm had actually been taught how to do this craft, and that it necessitated, I thought, great skill, concentration and attention to detail. He'd gone to London College of Printing, now London College of Communication, in the early 60s, and he'd been apprenticed to Hans-Gero Schläger, a prominent graphic designer and founding father of the discipline, really, who'd himself been taught at the Bauhaus in Dessau in Germany. Malcolm also told tales about how glamorous the job was in the 60s, as he was working as a freelancer in the offices of such émigré designers as Robert Brownjohn and Bob Gill and Hans Schläger himself. His profession was mixed up in the explosion of pop art and music and advertising and publishing and film and television in the 60s. At this point, graphic design had only been really existed as a profession for about 40 years. William Dwiggins had first coined this term in the late 20s in opposition to the term commercial artist, which often seemed like a bit of an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms. Since then, the term graphic design has been in and out of fashion, I suppose some of the following terms are kind of interchangeable. So, are you a graphic designer? And the etymology of this term is to design is to prepare the preliminary sketch or the plans for a work to be executed, especially to plan the form and structure of, to plan and fashion artistically or skillfully, or to intend for a definite purpose, or to form or conceive in the mind, or to contrive or plan. What's interesting about the word design is that it has both positive connotations, I think, and sometimes quite negative connotations, because this idea of contrivance, you have designs on someone, suggests a certain level of manipulation, perhaps. Again, the kind of definition comes from the Latin designare, which means to mark out or to devise or to choose or to designate, to appoint. And to mark, like a sign, which again I think is kind of really key to the idea of graphic design, the idea of marking and signage. This is important. Design is a verb. This is the common thing, is we design. It's not a noun. It's a doing word. The word graphic itself comes from the idea of something that's vivid or picturesque. And I think what's interesting for kind of graphic design is this idea that it's of or for writing or belonging to drawing. And again, the etymology of it goes back to graphe, which means writing or drawing, or from graphene, to write, or of pertaining to drawing. So again, what I think is interesting is that conflation of the idea of something visual with something written, the idea that writing and drawing are very similar to each other here. Like I said, Dwiggins considered himself a commercial artist, but since then we've had lots and lots of other terms like the visual communicator, and you may be kind of aware of some of these terms because there are often degree courses that are called visual communication. That was a term really kind of, I think, suggested in the late 60s to suggest a much more expanded field of kind of visual communications rather than just graphic design. There are courses called communication design, again, which suggests maybe something much broader, maybe involving filmmaking and photography and kind of other disciplines as well. There is this term, information architect, the idea that you are manipulating and handling kind of information in various ways, and you're building structures by which information is read. The idea of a user interface designer is a kind of very recent invention, with the idea of like making websites and online experiences, and you're thinking about user interfaces and how the audience deal with certain kinds of content. And again, the idea of an experiential interface designer, which perhaps is more about the kind of relationship between on-screen and physical interactions and experiences and designs. Are you an illustrator? Is an illustrator just like a subspecies of kind of graphic design or a kind of subset? Some graphic designers are great illustrators. Some illustrators are great graphic designers. To some, the terms are kind of quite interchangeable. And this idea of illustration comes from illumination, from the idea of spiritual, intellectual enlightenment. So I'd like to make a number of statements about what I think perhaps graphic design is. After this lecture, you'll also have a number of tutors who are also going to talk about their definitions about what they think graphic design is. First of all, I think, yes, of course it's a job, but primarily for me, graphic design is a language. And I suppose, let's look at this image. This is image number 2. It's a photo that I took back in 2006 at the bottom of Kirkgate in Leeds. And it's obviously a kind of half-built apartment building and shows what is obviously, I think, an advertisement for a newly released portable Sony PSP. It's a fairly uncomplicated piece of promotional graphic design, perhaps supposed to be simple and bold enough to capture the attention of passers-by, either on foot or in the car. We can see 3 distinct forms of communication here. There is the abstract lozenge shape of the white space that is supposed to connote the Sony screen. There is the typography, what looks like the rather neutral avant-garde bold, saying 24-hour garage here, and then there are icons on the bottom of the right-hand corner. Looking again, there is a kind of puzzle or a game here. Is this advertising a soon-to-be-built 24-hour garage? No, of course not. The combination of these different language streams adds up to a bit of a pun that is only concretized by the addition of those icons in the bottom right-hand corner. We see the very stereotypical sign for music, the crotchet sign that attaches itself to the strapline, promising that we will hear garage music on their device, potentially for 24 hours at a time. That could probably do some real damage to both your head and your ears. So why does the crotchet sign come to stand for that abstract notion of music? It's a graphic symbol that we as an audience come to agree, coming from our culture, that it will stand for music. At the same time, the other pictographic icons also announce that the new portable device will be able to take photos. So we see this very stereotypical image of the camera here. And I think it's interesting to think about how these symbols have so little to do with the technology as it moves on. We now take pictures with our phones, but the symbol for photography is still that notion of a camera that derives from over a century of our knowledge of what a camera might look like. We also see a film strip, which again connotes film and perhaps also television, and bears little relationship to actually how we now consume moving image. The games controller icon is, I suppose, Sony's rather vain attempt to use the iconic shape of their own Sony PlayStation controller as a symbol of all gameplay. And finally, we see a circle bounded by a grid of lines. We again read this perhaps not as an image exactly, but as a form of perhaps modern hieroglyphics that spells out internet. But is this already old-fashioned? Do we now use the Wi-Fi with the concentric lines to communicate this large amorphous phenomenon? Is this an image? It's made up of a combination of signs and symbols, words and shapes. But it's also a piece of wrapping on a building, and it's also quite site-specific. It's like a piece of art. And it's only really understandable in context with the building that it's plastered onto. So perhaps it's attempting to make me look at the building or the cityscape anew, to think about possibilities and the potential of all these half-built buildings within the city. It's quite a subtle piece of communication in the end, using a bit of a silly pun, something having a double meaning, to make the audience ponder for a moment. But how long is that moment? So is it to appeal to the audience's intelligence, their sense of getting it? Would I still get this subtlety travelling in my car past at 30 miles an hour? Is this a simple billboard? Or is it perhaps like a piece of site-specific art like Jenny Holz's Truisms in Times Square in 1982? Or is it perhaps like a piece of wrapping like Christo's site-specific concealment of the Red Square in Moscow? Well, this is a piece of direct promotional marketing communications that asks the audience to engage with the message, to do some work in order to complete it, I think. It uses fairly conventional forms of graphic language, words, images, colours, shapes and symbols, in a kind of heady brew that's harnessed together to communicate an idea or an attitude. In many ways, it seems like a simple cliché communication, based on the audience's prior understanding of these words and images. But I think there's also a subtle playing with or subversion, a kind of turning things upside down. And I think this seems important to talk about as a piece of visual communication. I think the message is always completed or ignited in the mind of the viewer. And also, let me make another statement. Graphic design, I think, is, finally, a job. This is the cover of a now defunct lifestyle magazine, Sleaze Nation. It's designed by the art director Scott King. It depicts Cher, the American singer whose song Believe, with its weird auto-tuned vocals, was riding high in the charts at the time. So in this image, she's conflated with the iconic image of Che Guevara. Her image turned into a simple graphic image that echoes the poster of Che Guevara from the late 60s, pasted against a flat red background. The masthead echoes the sense of political subversion and revolution with its use of a stencil font, whilst the strapline, again in a more neutral sans serif, Helvetica, I think, asks if we believe in revolution. This image, of course, riffs off the renowned image of Che Guevara disseminated in the late 60s as a symbol of guerrilla revolutionary cool at the time of massive student protests. Here is my copy of the poster handed down by my parents as a kind of family heirloom, now hung on the corridor wall in a frame as a piece of kind of interior design. It's an image I remember really vividly from my old childhood, and I think it haunted me a little. Che's faraway stare, which was supposed to perhaps symbolise a form of stoic, steadfast revolutionary strength, echoing all those Russian images of the heroes of the revolution, disturbed me a bit as a child. Che here was not Che the man. He was symbolising something else, I think. He was symbolising an idea. So this poster transformed a real man with a real lived life into a set of symbols or icons, a form of kind of hieroglyphics that communicated something vague about revolution or youth or freedom. So the image itself was taken by a documentary photographer called Alberto Corda, who was commissioned to document the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s. Corda said that for him, the image represented Che's absolute implacability and anger and pain. Perhaps this is what disturbed the younger me in this image. Its representation of revolutionary fortitude, its echoes of Christ-like sacrifice. It was entitled Guerrilla Heroica, could then be turned into a piece of propaganda or advertising for the Cuban Revolution. Corda, in sympathy for the Cuban Revolution, allowed this image to be used copyright-free by whoever wanted to disseminate it. So this version on my wall is actually by the Cuban graphic designer Jose Gomez Fresque, who used Corda's image for free. And this image came from a free handout, I think, in the countercultural magazine The International Times. It's said to be perhaps the most disseminated image in the world and has become a bit of a mainstay of student houses and halls of residence the world over. Do you have this image on your wall at home or in your halls of residence? This image, to find currency within the culture, to become a kind of meme, had to become a symbol rather than a specific portrait of a specific person at a particular historical moment. It needs to stimulate ideas out there in that culture at the time and to reinforce and extend those ideas, to make those abstract ideas real or aspirational. So it comes to stand for all those abstract ideas of rebellion or youth or revolution or resistance, as if you'd actually written those words down. So the designer both reflects and refracts the culture that they're designing for, so that these images reflect pop art, and particularly kind of Warhol's screen prints, for instance, whilst also going out into a culture that was protesting the Vietnam War and rising up on the streets of places like Paris and Chicago. The image then becomes a kind of brand. Scott King's images riff off this history, and he was commissioned as an independent graphic artist to produce a series of posters for a Cambridge University Freshers' Week, as you had last week, by a German gallerist, who, when talking to King, kept calling Che what sounded like Cher. So King used this slip of the tongue to make this silly pun, conflating Cher with the Cuban revolutionary. King seems to be talking about how revolutionary ideas, as they are evinced in iconic graphic images like this, are hollowed out and commodified to become boring mainstream marketing campaigns. Pop music that once promised a kind of revolutionary countercultural resistance had become stale and boring. King now says that he fucking hates that image. It's the bane of my life. I had to stop self-Googling because of it. And it's interesting that as a designer, as an art director, it was used as a cover for Sleaze Nation. But very quickly, Scott King tried to redefine himself as a fine artist. And we see here the image of Che Guevara in a gallery in Berlin. And as a result of this, it's become, I think the image becomes almost meme-like. So it's been kind of transferred from like kind of Viennese cafes on the left to T-shirts to kind of posters and billboards used for International Women's Day here. Graphic design then, I think, is a way of communicating abstract ideas in an attempt to engage in a conversation with its audience. It communicates using the audience's prior cultural knowledge of their culture and assigning new meanings to people and objects and things. It is actively constructing meaning. Sometimes it's kind of cliched or hackneyed, as I suppose everyone within a culture understands the cliche, But I think it's also the designer's job to subvert the cliche, to play with what's known, and to kind of take us somewhere new, to make us see something anew, or to ascribe new meanings. It's interesting again that I think that Scott King goes from being an employed salaried graphic designer and art director on a magazine to wanting to become a freelance artist who sells his images for a particular fee rather than taking a kind of monthly as a graphic designer would. Here's another image I took back in 2006. This is the fourth image. This was taken in Selfridges in London, and it shows a piece of promotional graphic design by Barbara Kruger. It clearly states unequivocally that I shop, therefore I am, a phrase taken from Descartes' famous aphorism, I think, therefore I am. The point of sale board uses Futura Bold, a typeface designed by Paul Renner in the 1920s, and often seen as a left-wing or anti-fascist typeface against white and red in a way that echoes the colour scheme of early left-wing graphics, and especially those from Soviet Russia. I took this photo because I was confused and bemused and horrified, really, in equal measure by what I saw adorning some casual sweaters in the store. At first, I knew it to be a riff on Kruger's work, and I wondered whether Selfridges had actually bought the copyright of this from Kruger herself. I found out that, in fact, she was commissioned herself by Selfridges to make this work. Kruger herself was trained as a graphic designer, and in her artwork used the visual languages of design to make ambivalent, ambiguous, declarative statements in bold type. There's a kind of standoff in a lot of her work between the typographic boldness of her work with their more open-ended potential meanings. Her original work here has been used countless times to suggest a culture where consumerism has run amok, where the act of buying is mixed up with the very essence of being. In its original incarnation, there is still some subtlety and ambiguity. However, here she riffs off her own work, so that art now has become commerce, and the work is actually used to sell casual sweaters to an audience who, ironically, are aware of their own complicity within the capitalist system, whilst also still buying the casual sweaters that are being sold at Selfridges, because they are sophisticated enough to understand the ironic nature of this campaign. It's like looking down a hall of mirrors where your image is repeated ad infinitum. Again, I would say graphic design activates something in the audience, feelings, ideas, notions, and triggers these vague notions into something more concrete. In a way, it kind of weaponizes the act of communication. Abraham Games once used the analogy of communication being like a bullet in a gun. It needs the designer to pull the trigger to release the power of the message. Here, we see how a renowned poster by Alexander Rodchenko that sought to produce a drive for books in the new Bolshevik post-revolutionary period has become debased as a series of graphic cliches, to the point where the Halifax Building Societies use this as a simple graphic device. So graphic communication is, I think, by its very nature, everywhere, and it is every day. It is the packaging on a Tate & Lyle golden syrup pot that aims to package, I think, a sense of history about the product, whilst also actually at the same time eclipsing the role that slavery played in the production of the sugar that the company is founded on. It is the symbol of the lion, a strong, fearless king of the jungle and of the British. It is the typography on a plastic carrier bag that says that by buying from the shop I will be making the world a better place, whilst also contributing to environmental damage by buying carriers like this. It is the road signs that seem to say that bikes will be flying low over parents and their children, but that we know through convention means that I should expect to see pedestrians and cyclists on my way through the university campus. It is the trainer boxes we keep because the branding makes them really desirable until we simply choose to throw a box away in the middle of the street. And it's the old Art Nouveau lettering above an old co-op that talks of a time in the late 19th century where businesses might be opened and run by the workers themselves, a kind of utopian prospect. But at the same time, it's also the stamped out iron manhole covers where some manual worker in the early 20th century has had to forcibly, with great skill and effort, stamp out the letters of the foundry into hot metal. It's the slab serif Egyptian font that has come to symbolise the city of Leeds through its street signs that have become distressed and rubbed away through time and lack of civic pride, where once this typeface spoke of the fashion of Egyptology in the 19th century, and particularly of a kind of civic pride in an industrial city. It is the cool authority of that map that shows undergraduates like you where you're supposed to be. It is the signage for a chicken shop to be illuminated at night through acrylic, and it's also the graffiti that's come to scar that shop front, an attempt by the taggers to own a little bit of the street like those business owners have. It's the strong Leeds accent of the industrial vernacular of stencils on the side of skips as landlords throw out the remnants of student hovels. It is the insignia on that Volkswagen that promises cleanliness, efficiency and reliability, right at the time that the company was misleading its consumers with faked environmental results from their diesel engines. And so graphic design is also nowhere. Graphic design is also now and here. It's ephemeral, it's disposable. Graphic design is also persuasive. Here we see a poster by Abraham Games. I think it's a very beautiful and poetic and quite enigmatic poster produced to prevent its audience from smoking. So in its combination of image and shape and colour, using cues and ideas within our culture, is a highly powerful medium. Games talked about his graphic communication being minimum means, maximum communication, meaning that his graphic design attempted a kind of visual poetry where all constituent parts of the message were working at full force to communicate its message. But is this too enigmatic? Does it credit the audience with far too much visual intelligence? Is it immediate enough? Art, through the act of and the process of defamiliarization, will ask the viewer to slow down, to look, and perhaps look again. Here, the language of graphic design uses the viewer's perception to complete the picture. It's what's called gestalt. It might slow you down and it might stay with you, but should it be more direct in its address to you? Should it use humour, really badly, to lighten the message, or to sprinkle some sugar on the bad tasting message? Should it attempt to shock you into behaving differently, to show what you can't see in your body, and knowing that you're often kind of quite squeamish about the effects of your own mortality? Should it try to seduce you with aesthetics and beautiful images so that it might reveal something of the real horror? So which campaign do you think would work best? Is graphic design always aiming for short-term benefits over long-term effects? So graphic design is also technological. For most people who have very little idea about what graphic designers do, they might characterise graphic communication as working with computers. And the discipline is, I suppose, inextricably associated with the means of technological reproduction, whether this is the simple pencil, whether this is letterpress printing from the 16th century when Gutenberg revolutionised the very means of production and therefore also democratised knowledge itself, from coal metal to hot metal that allowed magazines and newspapers to be printed and disseminated to vast parts of an educated and literate society in the late 19th century, to photography that finally captured what the world looked like and allowed everybody to be able to capture that reality and therefore opened up new ways of seeing the world, to moving image and cinema that told stories, both fictional and documentary, about that world, and to the early computer that borrowed from that real world with its graphical user interface and then allowed typography and graphic design to become easily accessed, to become perhaps expressive and experimental, and also opened up graphic design to new forms of production and distribution so that everyone could become perhaps a graphic communicator. So here is, for instance, the evolution of the Guardian newspaper. Here it's printed using monotype and linotype, hot metal, through to photo composition in the late 60s that allow much greater relationship between image and text, through to then desktop publishing in the 80s and 90s. We can see the kind of change of aesthetics in relationship to the means of reproduction here. So from kind of black and white photography through to colour photography, from real and tangible newspapers that are printed daily and read by hundreds of thousands of people in a rather undifferentiated kind of mass, to a much more niche kind of product for smaller audiences, to a service that's finally individually tailored through personal choice and algorithm straight to your pocket. So graphic communication has turned immaterial and intangible, but ever more powerful in some ways by its disappearance online and onto iPhones. So as we move away from designing tangible artifacts, as graphic communicators, we start to design experiences and systems. Technology has never really been neutral. Our messages are always shaped by the mediums that we use. In many ways, as Marshall McLuhan said, the very medium is the message. We learn to adapt our communications for the platforms that we use. Technology is a kind of magic and a kind of liberation, but it can also limit and close down dialogue and discussion. And recently we've seen democracy. As graphic communicators, we need to have a critical stance on these technologies that we use. Graphic design is also informative. Here, Margaret Calvert and Jock Kinnear were commissioned to design the system of signage for Britain's roads in the early 60s. And the combination of simple, flat, modernist colour and sans serif typography reproduced at vast scales gave the system a sense of uniformity and easy recognition that was highly functional, but also seemed to turn its back on the historic and local vernacular sense of place traditionally associated with the British landscape. These were perfect accompaniments to the slew of new motorways and towns and architecture that sprung up in the post-war reconstruction of Britain. They were both beautifully clear as information, but at the same time, I think formed a visual identity for a new Britain constructed around the welfare state. Like Harry Beck's London Underground map of the 30s, there is a sense that this graphic design cuts away anything extraneous to concentrate on simplicity and efficiency in its communication of information. It always ended up, and I think what's interesting, it always ends up as a form of graphic identity, as a form of branding. Here again, information is not neutral. Graphic designers shape that information to make the world easier to use and to navigate. Beck's map, of course, is not geographically accurate. Stations that seem distant on the map are in the real world in quite close proximity. He designed this to get to a more complex truth about how people actually move around the city, and that they think in terms of lines and connections and destinations. And Beck shapes reality by actually designing the map, since London has been created in the image of the map itself, with, for instance, house prices exploding along certain underground routes, with the creation of suburbia, or what's called Metroland, in the 20s and 30s as a result of the clarity and simplicity of commuter travel that was communicated by this map. There is never simple objective information or data. The graphic communicator is always shaping that information. And again, we need to think about what gets omitted or lost in the shaping of that information. So, there were your first 8 images out of the 50 that we'll be analysing over the next 7 weeks. I've attempted to give you some ideas about what might or might not constitute graphic design by looking in some depth at discrete examples of imagery. I think it's always advisable to go back to the images themselves when discussing something so big and all-encompassing. And so for Monday's seminar, I'd like you to think about what's been presented to you this week, and I'd like you all to write your own definition of what you think graphic design is on your Cage page, please. Thank you very much, and see you Monday.